Well, welcome to And Why Is That? You may ask, what is the purpose of And Why Is That? It's the question that journalists seem not to ask nowadays. And my name's John Cannianis. I've spent 40 years in communication and marketing and all of those activities, and also in the political environment from time to time. And my co-host is Alexander Korn. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I started off as a journalist in automotive, and I've moved into public relations and marketing over the last 40 years.
You must have asked the question many times, and why is that? In fact, you came up with the title.
I did, yes. I have asked that question quite a lot.
Sadly,
sometimes you don't get an answer to that.
Sometimes you don't. But it would help if you ever had the question asked, or what do you mean by that? Another version of the same thing. So what we're going to be doing over the course of these podcasts is we will be interrogating various topics of interest from the political, the commercial and the social world, and we'll be talking to a subject matter expert in each case. And at each conversation, we'll try and do a bit of a deep dive to unpack why is that? Why do things play out the way that they play out, and what is the impact of the things we are talking about? We try not to take ourselves too seriously, but some of the topics we're talking about are reasonably serious.
They are. They could be the difference between the end of the world and not the end of the world.
At the end of the world, that's fairly serious, but I'm not too sure whether the end of the world is nigh, but it's one of the topics we're going to interrogate.
It certainly is.
So hope you enjoy the podcast, and we'll be talking to our first guest, Matt Harris, or Matthew, depending on which way he likes to be referred to, and we'll be talking about the upcoming election here in Australia. And is it in fact the case that close elections are decided by 15% of people who don't care?
A frightening thought.
Well, welcome to And Why Is That? And why is that? And you may ask, why are we asking why is that? Because it's the question that most often is not asked by today's media. So today we're going to explore the topic that surprised me a great deal the other day when our guest, Matthew Harris, and I conducted amongst some other colleagues, a pre-election forum. And Matthew at one point, having we'll talk more about his background in a minute, but having run a few campaigns, said what you've got to understand is that 15% of people don't make up their minds who they're going to vote for until they've almost got the pencil in their hand, which is a really frightening thing.
It is when you consider how small the margins are in many, many constituencies.
And how small they may well be in this upcoming election.
Tight.
So the topic we're seeking to interrogate is, why is it that people who don't care get to choose our government?
And how dangerous is that?
Indeed. And our guest and subject matter expert is Matthew Harris, who's director of Barton Deakin. I got it the other way around. Barton Deakin. They're two electorates too, aren't they?
They certainly are.
They are, yes. Barton Deakin, which is a government relations firm, very well known in this marketplace. And he's also previously been the state director of the National Party here in Victoria. So he's run a couple of campaigns, and he's been a political staffer for a long time at state and federal level. So he's run a few campaigns, and we'll be talking about how you run a campaign to engage with people who don't want to be engaged with. But I want to go back one step. Alexander and I have both come from other countries to Australia. I came from New Zealand, and I participated in the political activities in New Zealand from very early age. Before they introduced the maddening and completely insane mixed member proportional system that doomed them to minority governments forever and a day, they ran they ran a completely first-past-the-post system, unicameral. So only one chamber. There was no upper chamber to be a check on it. It was a 90-member parliament, unicameral, first past the post, and voluntary voting. A model that's not that common anymore. But the UK, apart from being bicameral, that is the House of Lords and the Commons, is also, both of you from the UK, is also first past the post still?
Yes.
It certainly is.
Yes. What's wrong with that model, and why did it need to change?
We could fill the entire conversation up debating this. I've been here best part of 20 years now in Australia, and when I first got here, I was very surprised that voting was compulsory. Having grown up in the UK, where it was voluntary, that I thought that was normal. And we've just observed a US election not that long ago, where again voting is optional. What that creates is an environment where you, as a political operative or political parties and candidates, have to convince people to turn up to vote on election day. So you need to appeal to your base, whether it's on the right or the left of politics. You've got to inspire them to come out and vote for you. The difference here in Australia is because the voting is compulsory, the people at either end of the political spectrum are voting anyway, and the debate then becomes how do you convince the people in the middle to vote one way or the other. And that's the big difference between having a compulsory system and an optional system.
Yeah. Was it a surprise to you when you came to Oz? And you spent some time in South Africa, which was not a democracy really.
We had a vote occasionally.
You had a vote occasionally, yes. But how did you find the concept of compulsory voting? Because I was, like you, rather surprised.
Well, as a student of political science, both at school and university, I was quite involved and aware of the political system in the UK and thought it worked quite well. And it was quite shocking, in fact, to come to Australia and find that you were forced to vote, particularly because at the time that I came to Australia 30 years ago, it didn't seem like politics was a particularly relevant or important part of people's day-to-day lives. And therefore,
No, it's not.
Well, and maybe today it still isn't. And therefore, you're forcing people to make decisions that they may not have any interest or buy into whatsoever. And that can, as you said in the introduction, that can impact on the result quite considerably, especially when you have this thing like the donkey vote, where people just go in and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 without giving it any thought whatsoever.
So, Matt, why do you think that this compulsory voting concept originated? I mean, I don't have the knowledge. I haven't done. Of course, we stick to a very firm rule in this podcast. We do no research whatsoever, so we have no real understanding of what we're talking about, which is why you're here. Why do you think that compulsory voting became the situation here in this marketplace? I don't think there are many other democracies that have compulsory voting.
No, it's very unusual, and I will not claim to be an expert on the history of how it came about, but perhaps I will say that in my view, having now experienced it as someone who's worked in politics and run political parties and campaigns, I think we actually get a better outcome, frankly. So I've shifted my view. The fact that we have to try and communicate to those disengaged voters in the middle of the political spectrum means that we don't get the extreme politics that you perhaps get in alternative systems. So again, if I refer back to what played out in November in the United States, both sides were appealing or attempting to appeal to their base with quite extreme policies on the right and the left. We don't see that here. We have a much more moderate debate, and there's also a few issues where people would argue that things are a bit more extreme, but the reality is we've got a more centrist political discussion, and the challenge then becomes how do you engage people to be interested in what you're putting forward as opposed to pandering, frankly, to your base on the right or the left.
So what you're suggesting is that there's a bifurcation in a two-party system like the USA where there's voluntary voting. I think they get about 50% of people turning up to vote.
Yeah, maybe a bit more, depending.
Low 60s, I think.
One of the challenges that I think both major parties have here is to understand what is driving those disengaged voters. It's very easy to surround yourself by people who have similar views. So a political party, people tend to have broadly similar views. And if you listened to your membership and the people that you spend most time with, you'd be putting forward policies that mean nothing to these disengaged voters in the middle of the outer suburbs of a capital city, for example.
So surely if you've got a system where you don't have compulsory voting and you've got two key parties, power is likely to alternate between the two parties. If you have a compulsory voting system and then you end up with a more divisive or divided community, there's more chance that the minor parties are going to spring up with some crazy ideas that are perhaps completely unworkable, but they might be appealing to the people in the middle.
Well,
and therefore you're going to end up with hung parliaments or minority governments.
You end up with these minority coalitions.
And now, I mean, if you go back 30 years, Australia was a lot more unified culturally, or the dominant culture was more overwhelming. Now, after 30 years I've been here, the migration has brought in people from other parts of the world who've got different experiences from a government perspective. That's going to be muddying the waters as well. So what is the prospect of having strong government in Australia now with this system where you're mandating everybody has to vote, but the outcome you're going to get from it is going to be more confusion and chaos. Sure.
And overlaid over that is, of course, the preferential voting structure. And I'd like to interrogate the idea of why do we make people vote for somebody they don't want to vote for effectively by making second, third and fourth, et cetera, choices. Because then you throw up this situation where they may have a clear idea who they want to vote for, even if they made up their mind in 15 minutes before, who they want to vote for as primary choice, but then it's like a complete donkey vote as to who they're going to vote for afterwards. And someone ends up benefiting out of that. And we've seen the situation with the preference whisperers where someone who got 16 primary votes gets in.
Becomes a senator.
And becomes a senator.
And I was going to make that point. The preference whispering is happening in the upper house where you're not electing your direct representative in the lower house of whether it's a state or a federal parliament. But the preference system, I actually do think leads to a better outcome in the long run. So if you take the example of the UK at the moment, we've got a Labor government in power with a pretty healthy majority. Now, the reality is they got that with the primary votes in the 30s. The rise of reform, which has had various iterations in the past, but reform basically split the Conservative vote. If there'd been preferential voting in the UK, it would have been a Conservative government quite comfortably, I think. And look at the polls now. Reform are around 25%, just ahead of the Labor Party, and the Tories are perhaps early 20s. If there was a preferential system there, a Reform and Tory government would win comfortably at the next election. The reality is that's not going to happen because of the first past the post system. So I think the preference system does mean you get an outcome that reflects broadly the view of the local community that's voted for an MP.
The least worst option.
And there's no perfect system in democracy. No. But what we are going to see, particularly at the next election, and it's happened in recent state elections as well, is the primary votes for both major parties are dropping drastically. Right. I mean, we've got depending whether you believe the accuracy of the polls, the Labor Party is consistently in the early 30s, and the Liberal National Coalition is a high 30s. I mean, not that long ago, the combined vote was well over 70 or 80% for the two major parties. Now we've got this frustration with the major parties, and their primary votes are dropping, and people are looking elsewhere. And that's seen, obviously, the rise of a number of independents, the Teal movement, and others around the country. And I think at the election we're about to be part of in May, we're going to see that happen even more. So I think we referred to earlier, there's going to be a number of seats that come down to a handful of votes, and it will be a handful of votes and the preferences that decide those outcomes. To your point, John, about people not necessarily knowing where their vote's going, I think both parties are going to make much more of a play in this election to make sure that the preferences are flowing the way they need them to flow.
Well,
So the how to vote card is going to play a much greater role.
Is, and a public awareness of the risks of putting something which the party sees
donkey
wrong.
vote.
What you're saying and the numbers that you're talking about in terms of first preferences suggests that not only is it potentially that our governments in a close election are elected by 15% of people who don't care, but they're elected on preferences, not on primary votes, because the primary vote isn't enough to get them across the line. So a how to vote card is now becoming really, really critical.
Yeah, and it's worth reminding everybody that you don't have to follow a how to vote card.
No.
Often there's a debate in the media around which party has preferenced whom, and lots of controversial discussions around what how to vote cards might look like, but they're only a recommendation from a party. They're not an instruction, and people do have.
Although for people who are unfamiliar with the system, I think they could have an outsized influence on how people vote in certain communities. People who are new to Australia.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why parties, and having run a number of campaigns over the last few years, that's why you put so much effort into making sure as many people as possible get your how to vote card. Whether that's the traditional way of having your volunteers with a coloured T-shirt standing there on election day, or whether, as we've done in the last few elections, when sending a bulk text message out with a photograph of the how to vote card to tens of thousands of people in the community to try and get that information in front of people, because making sure that you get the preference flows running the way you want them to run is crucial.
So let's just interrogate that a bit further. That was where we started with the concept that perhaps 15% of people only make up their mind with a pencil in a hand. And why we still use a pencil is another topic, but we'll come to that at another point. I think we've invented the pen by now, but anyway.
Well, you can rub them out more easily when you're tallying them.
That's true. As Stalin said, it doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts the votes. Going back to the concept of those disengaged voters, as someone who's run campaigns, what are the techniques to engage them? I mean, as a marketer, we understand the motivators for people. Fear is one of the biggest motivators. It's ugly, but that's the reality. Fear is one of the biggest motivators. Fear of missing out is another huge motivator. And as Paul Keating, I think, famously said, never get in the way of self-interest.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The reality is that negative campaigns work. People don't like them. They get frustrated by them, particularly the people who've already made their mind up. But the reality is you're trying to talk to that smaller group of people who haven't made their mind up, and negative ads, whether it's demonising a policy or an individual, it works. And we've seen in the last few weeks the Labor Party have been very successful in trying to position a view about Peter Dutton. And that's been reflected in some polling shifts that we've seen in the last short period. So it does work, and you're right. Fear of the unknown is a genuine issue. The other point you made was what's in it for me.
Yeah.
And this is why elections are often about what am I getting? Am I getting
what am I
a tax cut?
for?
Am I getting a tax cut? Am I going to get a grant to help me pay my electricity bills, or am I going to get a new railway station or
train to the
road?
airport, maybe.
So that's what we term as retail politics, basically, and that goes down to the grassroots level, electorate by electorate. What benefit are we getting here? And we made this point when we were talking at our forum the other day. That, I did anyway, and I think you all agreed, that policy is hard, personalities are easy.
Well, and that was going to be my next point, because talking about this group of people who are disengaged, they're not interested, they're probably not even listening to parties or candidates saying, well, if you vote for me, I'll rebuild the local football stadium. They're not listening to that. With these individuals, it's about making sure they recognise the name of the candidate. And, I would get polling on a regular basis for seats that I was trying to win, and the first thing I looked at was the name ID and whether that was going up with the candidate.
Yeah.
So the vote was interesting. That's what you see on the front page of the newspaper that everyone gets excited about. What's the primary vote and what's the two-party preferred vote? What I was mostly concerned about, certainly in the lead up to an election, was does anyone actually know who my candidate is? And often, sometimes you get people with a bit of a local identity and that gives you a head start. But more often than not, the first time you do a poll with a new candidate, maybe 3 or 4 months out from election, 3% of the population might know them. And I think even half of that 3% probably just said, I know them because I don't want to admit I don't know them. So really the most important thing was getting that name ID up. And it's why you see leaflets appearing in your letterbox all the time. It's core flutes all over people's front yards or on fences in regional communities. And it's none of those signs on people's fences say, vote for this person, you're going to get a new football club, a new football stadium, or a discount on your electricity bill. It just says Matt Harris.
Matt Harris is a name.
Yeah. And so that is the most important thing, because you want these people at the end of the day to come in to vote, whether it's in early voting or on election day, going, oh, I recognise Matt. He looks like a nice guy. I'm going to vote for him. Because I haven't heard of the other ones.
The last campaign in 22 was heavily characterised by a dislike of Scott Morrison by a large chunk of the electorate, which was capitalised on to create the Teal movement. My personal view is that's the doctor's wives scenario, and you see where they all live. They've all sent their kids to private schools, and they're all now, their biggest decision in life is whether to holiday in Whistler or Positano, and they're saving the world one cocktail party at a time. That sounds frivolous, but that's the reality of what actually happens. But there was a visceral dislike of Scott Morrison because of his religious standing, being a happy clapper, as it's known, because
being a father,
he was seen to be way too traditional. All sorts of things. You would have a far better understanding, but let's not go into the detail of that. But that led to a movement of votes that cost the coalition government, if nothing else. On the other hand, we had Albanese, who there was a great deal of doubt that he was up to the job, and he stumbled numerous times during the election. And my view is that the principal view of him right now is that he's weak. But they're going to turn Dutton into Voldemort. And the problem for Dutton also is he's not Gavin Newsom. He's quite the opposite of Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom in California is the Hollywood idol, and they'll all vote for him because he looks great. He talks garbage, but he looks great. Poor old Dutton doesn't look all that great. They've put him in the glasses. That helps. This is coming from us, mind you, but nonetheless. How much of that is in play? I mean, surely the strategist must be thinking, okay, we've got to figure out how to make Dutton more likeable, but the guy doesn't look great on telly.
He'll get the bold vote, though.
You'll get our vote.
He's secured that already.
He's secured the bold
vote.
Well,
just to quickly touch on 2022, I mean, your point about Scott Morrison, I mean, Labor's core flutes at polling booths in the 2 weeks before the election and on election day were pictures of him with a Hawaiian shirt on, just to remind people about the fact that he was on holiday at an unfortunate time for the country, shall we say. So,
and yet Albo didn't know how many people were unemployed.
Yeah. So the last election was not an endorsement of Labor and Albo. They won because there was a dislike of Morrison for a number of factors, rightly or wrongly. That's how it played out. So in the election we're about to face, people I think are pretty disappointed with the Prime Minister and how he's performed in the role, and perhaps his priorities have been wrong. And you're right, he does seem weak in the face of many of the challenges that are facing the country. And that's certainly something that the coalition have been trying to firm up in people's minds. On the flip side, Dutton has got a reputation, rightly or wrongly, of being this tough guy. And you're right, with Voldemort is very unfair, but that's something that was Labor did a very good job of him years ago when he had various ministerial roles in the previous coalition government, and that sticks with people. Now, but the reality is in the geopolitical environment we're in today, and as we've joked before, John, you wake up every morning at the moment and check the news to see what Trump has announced overnight while we've been asleep. And
half a dozen things he's
exactly.
done overnight. Yes.
In that environment, people want someone who's going to be strong and make the difficult decisions to protect Australia's interests. And I think that's where we're going to see the coalition trying to pitch Dutton. You don't have to be his best friend, and I should say he's actually one of the nicest people I know in politics. He's a genuinely good human being, even though the public persona is somewhat different. But he'll be positioned as a strong leader to take the country through some challenging times, which is very much in contrast to how people perceive Albanese.
So as a marketer, that's interesting because perhaps then you could actually use his lack of photogeneity as a benefit. Do you want handsome boy who does nothing, or do you want a bloke who could be your neighbour who is a genuine bloke and just gets on and does the tough stuff that has to happen? So I can see that might actually work.
Maybe he can hold a hose.
Yeah, maybe he can hold a hose. That was the most unfortunate turn of phrase.
It was.
Yes. I remember what the third one was, and it was the question that came up in our forum of the impact of youth vote and social media. Now, I've got some. And the answer we gave at the time is, I think, still valid, that it tends to coalesce in a number of places and it's not going to make a huge difference in seat-by-seat environment. But social media, everyone's spending a tremendous amount of time on social media. We see it as marketers all the time, but we see also a tremendous amount of effort wasted on social media because it's fashionable. Yeah. And because people hire young, out of school, keen to go young marketers who have got this running through their veins and they're talking to themselves. Is it really going to make that much difference? You mentioned that you might throw out some text messages with how to vote and so on and so forth. Is that really the way that those 15% of people are going? Is it, in fact, the 15% of people, are they influenced by that?
I hope so, because otherwise it's incredibly hard to reach them. Yes. But you're right. You can spend a lot of time and effort in a campaign worrying about the various different social media channels and making sure you've got the right content on each one and trying to segment the community and working out what message you want to provide to each group of people through various different channels. And campaigns are not fully resourced. It's not like the movies that you watch in the US where there's 50 interns sitting in an office on a small camp. Yeah, if only it was. These things are done on a much smaller scale. So it becomes a question of what's the best bang for your buck. And I don't just mean in terms of money, but in terms of your time and effort that you can put into things. And that's why you've of course got to be on Facebook and Instagram and now TikTok. But things like a text message, which just say, "Hi, I'm Matt, your local candidate," are important. Even if people read it and then just flick past it, everyone checks their phone when you get a text message. And if it's just about, as I talked about, getting that name recognition up and the fact that someone's reached out, even if you're not interested in responding to this message, that's important. It really is important. So when someone goes to vote, they go, Matt, he texted me and asked me how things were and what was important. I didn't reply, but at least he asked. That's as much as you're going to get out of most of those voters. Yes, you can spend a lot of money creating some very clever content for social media and even more money perhaps pushing it out to different groups. But at some point, you've got to just take a step back and go, I'm probably spending money talking to the same people again and again and again. And I laughed yesterday. I saw the Labor Party have made quite a clever AI cat video, which I'm not up with the local trends, but I think AI cats are quite popular at the moment, and the Labor Party made a video which have taken some time and effort to do it, and it's quite clever. But I expect it's only talking to people who are already engaged with the Labor Party and are voting for them.
And that's my next question is, you know who your supporters are. How do you reach out to people who are undecided?
Yep.
What characteristics do the undecided or the disinterested have that allow you to then go, okay, we're going to target them with this? Because if you don't know who they are, how do you know how to reach them?
And they're not homogenous either.
No, they're not.
No, they're not. And I remember having a conversation with some party members about this very issue a few years ago, because they were frustrated that they were receiving online ads or text messages. And I said, you're annoying people by advertising to them, or you're intruding on their privacy by sending them a text message. And I said, no, I understand that. And let's say I've sent out 20,000 text messages into an electro. I said 17,000, 18,000 people have probably already decided who they're going to vote for. And they're probably annoyed they got the message, but it's not going to change their mind.
No.
Yes.
It's the 3,000 people who haven't made their mind up yet that I was targeting, but I don't know who they are. I can probably, I've got some understanding of the demographics of whether it's younger women who are more likely to not decide compared to perhaps retired men. So you have got some data about where the undecided vote is stronger than other demographics, but the reality is I don't know the individuals. So the only way to get to those people is to do a broader communication piece. And yes, if I annoyed 25 people, and sometimes you wait for the responses on social media or reply to the text message going, you can imagine the language that's used occasionally.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's fine. If I've lost 25 votes, so be it. But I've talked to 3,000 people that I need to know that this candidate is called Matt and he's going to stand up for them.
Yeah.
So it's not as well, we pretend it's more precise in the marketing game and commercial marketing because we slice and dice the demographics and then we analyse who actually bought the product and we go, well, we go talk to more of those people. Yeah. We have the comfort of being able to do that. And so you can be a little more sniper than you have to be a bit more shotgun.
Yeah, and look, all parties have invested significantly in technology and data to really drill down into what drives particular groups of people. But the reality is, unless someone's told you that they voted a certain way, and that's obviously then kind of collected by the party that we can use that information, but unless someone's told you who they voted for, we've got no idea. It's a secret ballot where someone who's online shopping for a pair of shoes, you know whether they end up going down the marketing funnel and buying a pair of shoes, and you can remarket it. You can track them. You can't do the same thing in quite the same way with voters. You can certainly see by people's interactions with social media posts. So I've always encouraged the various MPs and staff and candidates that I've worked with over the years to really pay attention to the interactions on social media. If someone's liking your posts, commenting, saying what a great idea, thanks for turning up to my event, they're probably leaning your way. Mark that in your database and then we won't need to speak to them again. It's those other people that don't interact that you've trying to work out who they are, and you can do lots of clever calculations behind the scenes, and it certainly wasn't me doing them, looking at the demographic profiles of the sorts of people who vote certain ways and their likes and interests. You can make some reasonable assumptions about where to target particular messages, but to get it down to an individual is practically impossible.
Yeah. So with messaging, one of the I think John mentioned a couple of weeks ago that on the home pages of the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, Labor's got 8 different core messages, and the Liberals have got 4, and that's lovely. But in the American campaign of last November, I think one of the most impactful messages that I saw was that Kamala's for they, them, and Trump's for you, which was a very simple message that got a lot of issues involved in one nice catch line, and obviously had a bit of a resonance amongst undoubtedly the Trump diehards, but also the people who might have been sort of undecided. How difficult is it to come up with something like that?
And if I may, the point I was making with those comparisons of the key messages on their websites was that you're flat out, as we know as marketers, you're flat out getting people to remember 1, 2, maybe 3 things at best. 4 is already a stretch. The coalition had cost of living, housing, energy, and crime.
Yep.
I could remember those because I'm engaged. Most people would remember 1 or 2. The Labor Party had cost of living is our number 1 priority, and then 8 different points underneath as to how they were going to deal with it. No one is going to remember that.
Well, I expect a number of their candidates won't remember it either. Remember over a decade ago now where a Liberal candidate couldn't recite the plan.
Yes.
And it became a kind of viral example of
it's the plan, it's the plan.
Yeah.
The plan, the plan.
Exactly.
The plan?
Yeah.
The plan.
Yeah. And this is why, the Liberal Party have got their tagline of get the country back on track.
Yes, which is MAGA by another word.
Yeah. It's very short and simple. And frankly, if the Australian public can recite that by the end of the month election campaign, then the Liberal Party will be doing very well. People will not know the sub-dot points beneath that, which explains what's actually going to happen.
There was an interesting point made, in the forum that we had. I'm not sure whether it was you said it or whether it was Tully Smith, who's the Labor staffer, but that manifestos are primarily something that you produce to say that you've got one. Nobody ever reads the damn thing. Probably not even the candidates.
No, I think Tully and I both agreed on that point. Yeah. A lot of work goes into policies, and it's important that the work is done and there's rigor, because people who are engaged are going to actually delve into this and try and understand exactly what the parties are putting forward. And also, if you don't have anything worked through properly, the media are going to tear you to pieces, and that's the last thing you want. But as we're talking back to this group of people who are not engaged in politics and are forced to go and vote, they're not going to download the Liberal or Labor plan for Australia and read every single word. So the risk there is actually relatively low in my view. The risk that comes with that is the broader narrative about the campaign, about whether, and there's endless debates on TV, radio, and in the written press about which campaign is going well, and it feeds into the broader vibe, which does shift a few votes, but in a local seat, and those people who make their mind up as they turn up to vote, they might have picked up on the vibe about which part is going better. But if you ask them whether they remembered that candidate X said something silly 3 weeks ago, they like, who's that?
I did promise one of our listeners, viewers, that we would drop in. It's the Vive, it's the Marbo.
Yeah.
Yes. So do you think people who are unengaged or unengaged, do you think they'd want to vote for a party that's on the nose in the vibe?
No, which is exactly why it's important not to be on the side that's being seen to be heading in the wrong direction for whatever reason. So it's important to get that momentum, and also same as in the sports, people like to back the winning team. Yes. And if there's one side that feels like it's going forward and the other side's going backwards, people might gravitate towards that. And they go, they're going to vote, the blue team, they're going to win, so I should vote for them. So that's a really important part of that psychological game that is played throughout the campaign. Yeah.
If you're disengaged, do you remember who you voted for last time?
Well, that's an interesting point. So often in internal party polling, you actually ask the question, who did you vote for last time? And it's a surprising amount of people who can't remember.
Okay.
I'll put you down as undecided then.
Yeah, that's...
Well, undecided is a different category. Some people I haven't made... It's... Yeah.
So they're not even bright enough to say, I voted for a guy because of X, Y, and Z.
Well, if they can't remember the party they voted for, that shows you a level of disengagement.
And to be fair, often in that research, you're asking about the party as opposed to the candidate, and they might have voted for the candidate because they know the name.
A local name.
They're not sure which party they're in, but they know that Matt is a nice guy who lives locally.
Well, you mentioned that with one of the MPs that you worked for, who shall remain nameless, Darren Chester, he really focused in a regional electorate that everyone should know his name. That's all he really wanted to make sure.
If they know my name, think I'm a good bloke, and know that I love Gippsland.
Doesn't matter what party I'm with.
Yep.
Yeah.
And his primary vote's in around 70%.
And it works.
It works.
Yeah.
Obviously, a fairly safe National Party seat, but it's important that he's increased that vote time after time because he works really hard for his community and people know what he stands for.
Yeah. So they could very well answer your question with, I don't know which party I voted for because they voted for Darren.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which is all he needs.
Yeah. As we're getting to the end of the conversation, we could go on for another couple of hours.
But don't worry, folks, we won't.
Yes. What do we think is going to be the sort of outcome that it will have from this election, given that the Labor Party does have a significant numerical advantage over the coalition of 19 seats?
Look, I think we'll see the trend of the primary votes for both sides dropping again. Mm-hmm. And that means then you've got this block of votes in the middle which needs to flow back one way or the other. And I think it makes it quite unpredictable because, as we talked about earlier, people don't have to follow the how to vote cards and they increasingly don't. They go in and make their own decisions, particularly if they're voting for one of those smaller parties or independents. And many of the independents don't even have a how to vote card, in fact. So where those votes go is going to decide the result in a number of those seats, and it's going to be a number of seats that are very, very close, and it purely depends on how the preferences flow about whether the Labor Party or the Liberal Party pick it up. And we can talk about the Teals and other incumbent independents separately, but in a number of coalition versus Labor seats, the preference flows are going to be absolutely crucial. And as I say, as the primary votes drop for the major parties, where those votes end up spraying is going to make the decision, and frankly, will probably decide which of the two leaders can form a government. I think the general consensus is it will be a hung parliament of some description. The question is whether the coalition can pick up enough seats to get close enough to then try and form a minority government with some independents. But as you said, John, it's a lot of seats they need to pick up, and given the primary votes are depressed, my expectation is that it will be hard because you can't manage what the preference flows look like from some of those smaller parties and independents, and then seats you'd expect to win if the preference flows were tighter, perhaps, might not be won because they end up going the other way because the preferences have flown differently.
So you mentioned briefly there the dreaded Greens. We haven't discussed them at the threat of destroying the conversation. Let's bring up the Greens, but in context of youth as well, because I think it's fair to say that they have a fairly strong hold on a youth vote. And what's the famous saying that if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're 30, you don't have a brain. But yeah, they appeal to that experimental phase of the market, as we call it. The question was asked of us at the other gathering that surely they're going to have an outsized impact, these young people. My contention was two things. One, there probably aren't enough of them because we haven't been reproducing at 2.3, so there's actually less of them than there would have been in the past. But we don't have that baby boomer and Gen X bubble. And two, they tend to all coalesce in the same seats.
Correct.
So someone like Adam Bant might get an increased majority, but not going to get another seat. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, there was some research that was published, I think earlier this month that said.
Again, we didn't do any research, so this is top of the head.
Bant's increasing his vote and is consolidating in the seat of Melbourne. Yeah. But
it's not really helping the party,
it was dropping elsewhere. So I think in Victoria, in Wills and McNamara, the vote was down because the Greens started as a party that wanted to protect the environment. They rarely talk about that anymore, frankly. No, they talk about other social issues, and that they've moved away from their original purpose. And I think people are frustrated. And
Yes.
I can understand
Yes.
why there's attraction to some of the things they talk about, particularly for younger people, and
Yes.
they're quite vocal on housing affordability and rent, and some of their ideas on the surface seem attractive. When you actually unpick what they're planning, it's a very different story. But
they don't need to fully form a policy because they've got very little chance of ever
exactly,
enacting
it's
it.
easy to grandstand and say they were going to halve your rent, for example.
Yeah, we'll never be in a position to do
They're never
so.
going to do it.
Yeah.
But some of their more extreme views on social issues and Palestine, for example, having Greens MPs protesting every weekend in the middle of Melbourne and stopping traffic. That people say that's not what I voted for. I voted for you to stand up for me because I believe in action on the climate.
But not something that's happening.
Yes,
Yeah, well,
and there's
30,000 miles
alternative
away.
people to vote for, and particularly, if you look at the Melbourne example, that vote has gone to Teals, who are much more moderate
Middle
about
of the road.
There's actually, I
issues.
received a text from Senator James Patterson last night. You may have received the same one, where he had a photograph at a prominent intersection in the Kooyong electorate of Monique Ryan, the Teal, allegedly Teal independent, and it was in green, a huge billboard on this prominent building, huge billboard, and it said for 77% of the time Monique Ryan voted with the Greens, and that tells you that in that electorate, their research must be telling them the Greens have become toxic.
Exactly. And people voted for the Teals because they thought they were a softer version of the Liberal Party, perhaps. And we talked about the frustration with the then Prime Minister Morrison. The Teals presented themselves as a nicer face of centrist Liberal politics.
Yes.
The facts are very different, and as you said, their voting record speaks for itself. And the things they stand up and talk about are not things that I would suggest most people in their seats care about on a daily basis. And certainly as the economy has become more challenging over the last 2 or 3 years, people's views on what's important have changed as well. So in a strong economy and in the seats they represent, where people are relatively affluent, they care about environmental issues and action on climate change. The reality is people are now worried about their power bill landing on through the door and crime. So and that's not the space the Teals are
they've got nothing to say
playing
about
in. So they've got to work through what their message is going to be, because the people who voted for them last time have got different priorities perhaps to what they did 2 or 3 years ago.
But also I think the Liberals' complacency in those constituencies has been removed. Certainly in the constituency that I live in, the aspirant Liberal candidate
Who was the former member? Tim Wilson.
Has got his act together. And he's on our morning walks, his billboards are outnumbering the incumbents.
And Amelia Hamer in Kooyong is running a very strong campaign. But two final questions. And the first being the pollution of state and federal politics. Is it Victoria's? We mentioned it a couple of times. In Victoria, the Labor brand is, if not toxic, then very much on the nose. Is it enough to turn what has been in the past, years ago, it was a Liberal stronghold? It's become a Labor fortress. Is it enough to see them lose a number of seats? Do people confuse those two enough, and to blame one party for both the state mess and the federal mess? And the second question will be, if you got 72 seats, would you bother trying to form a minority government?
All right, we'll tackle the first one first because it's probably easier.
Yes.
People definitely understand the difference. And if you think about Queensland, that often goes in a different direction. People like to hedge their bets by having a different colour federally compared to a state level. However, the reality is parties share a brand. And if I was running the campaign this time around in Victoria, there would be pictures of Jacinta Allen next to every single Labor candidate all over polling booths. If you vote for this person,
this is what you're going to get.
This is what you're going to get.
Yeah, I ran a campaign a few years ago the height of Andrews' unpopularity in Victoria, and I had an opportunity to say that our opponent was, shall we say, friends with Andrews, and people were coming up on the polling booth going, "I'm not voting for him. He's mates with Dan Andrews." So people did kind of connect the two. So yes, there is most definitely an opportunity and a risk for the Labor Party, but there's an opportunity for the coalition to link the challenges that the state Labor government have got to kind of take the shine off Labor candidates, particularly in close seats where people are struggling and people don't necessarily understand the difference in responsibilities between the two levels. I mean, I've worked for MPs all over the country, and when people come into the office to raise their concerns, it's usually not
The wrong office.
It's the wrong office. And the last thing you do as an MP or a staffer is say, well, that's not my problem. Go and speak to the guy down the road. You try and help and guide them. But people don't know whether the federal government is responsible for the roads or whether it's the state MP. So, yes, absolutely using the connection where it's advantageous to get a point across is really, really important. But yeah, to think of the Queensland example again, the recently elected Christopher Lee LNP government is going pretty well. I think the Premier looked quite statesmanlike through the cyclone and pretty raised his profile quite a lot.
He didn't do a Gavin Newsom.
Exactly. So the issue, and because it's new government and they're travelling okay, there won't be an opportunity for the Labor Party there to say you need to have a different colour, different colour government compared to your state government. So
and they also, in fairness, they've just come off 10 years of a Labor Party government.
Yeah, and people understand that the state has got no money and significant debt, and there's concern about the mess they've left the Olympics in.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
In the right circumstances, it's really powerful. But then you look at New South Wales and South Australia, where you've got two pretty successful Labor governments and very popular premiers. So in those two states, Labor will be using Peter Malinowskis and Chris Minns to help boost their vote.
But you could argue that those two states are more centrist Labor governments, whereas Victoria and Queensland were very much more left Labor governments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But, at the end of the day, you use the advantage you've got to promote your candidates. And the second question.
My final question, yes. And if you were being Machiavellian and cynical about it all and you got 72 seats and you might be able to cobble together some sort of minority government as a coalition, would you bother or would you let the other side take the hit and then come back at it when it all falls apart in 18 months?
I've asked this of many senior members of the federal coalition team over the last few weeks and made the exact point that you just did, that, a minority government's going to be difficult and perhaps it's better to let the other side deal with the challenge and then expect it falls apart and then come back next time round and win a large majority. And if you look back at 2010 and 2013, that's exactly what happened. Gillard formed a minority government. It was hard work,
messy,
and then Abbott came in and had a resounding victory in 2013. So I've had those discussions. Now the reality is, if you've got the opportunity to become the Prime Minister and form a government and become members of the cabinet and sit on the blue carpet in Parliament House as opposed to the green and red carpet, that's a very difficult thing to say no to. So I think the reality is, if you've got the chance to form government, you form a government and you do the best you can, because the reality is, and obviously I'm biased, but there's a lot to be done to fix the country and point the country in the right direction. Dare I say, get the country back on track. There's a reason that phrase is being used. There's a reason it's being used.
What's his envelope under?
And another 18 months, 2 years, 3 years of the current government where things are drifting is not going to be good in the long run. So I think anyone who's got the opportunity to form a government, even if it's going to be harder than you'd hoped, then you've got to take that chance and do your best to get things fixed.
But from a personal perspective, if you were Peter Dutton, if you don't take that chance, what is the likelihood that you're going to remain as leader and you won't get the chance again?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And politics is actually internal. All of politics is internal. I said to my first ever politician I worked for said to me, have you enjoyed your first year in politics, Matthew? And I said, quite frankly, Minister, I thought we'd spend our time, attacking the opposition, but we spend all our time arguing amongst ourselves. And he said, welcome to politics.
Yes.
And you said, yes, Minister.
Yeah. It is about managing your internal stakeholders is the hardest part of politics, without a shadow of a doubt. You've got, particularly on the Liberal side, where the different groups are not quite so organised as perhaps the factional system in Labor. You've got people with different views who want to promote certain issues, and keeping everyone on message is a challenge. And to Peter Dutton's great credit, he has kept the Liberal Party on message and together for the last 3 years, which has been very different to how it's been in the past. And that is because of the hard work he's put into doing that. And it's not easy. It's really a challenge. And you reflect on perhaps the Liberal Party in Victoria, where all we've seen for the last decade is division and debate and arguments amongst themselves, as opposed to focusing on the issues that matter.
And who wants to vote for a divided party? No.
Yeah. And if someone had said to me when I was campaign director in Victoria for the last federal campaign 2022, when we lost government, if someone had said to me that in 3 years' time at the next federal election there was a chance of us winning, I would have burst out laughing. Now the reality is, because Peter's kept the team disciplined and together, there's a chance there's a change of government and there's a chance that he becomes Prime Minister in a few weeks' time. And that's
a week is a long time in politics.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating few weeks. Thank you very much for those insights. I'm horrified still at the idea that so many people are so disengaged in what matters to their lives, but then one needs to take a perspective of not everyone is as interested in politics as we are. But thank you for those insights. It's been a fantastic conversation, and we'll see what plays out over the next few weeks.
Thank you for having me.